We're going to begin our study of ecology by looking at how animals behave. We're going to add to that how animals behave in groups of their own kind and how animals behave in groups that have different species. We're looking at animal behavior or behavioral biology, chapter 55. Behavior is how an organism reacts to its environment. There are two types of behavior, learned and innate. Learned behavior is the result of experience. For example, stoves. Babies are not born with the knowledge that stoves are hot and dangerous. They have to actually put their hand on the stove and burn it to know that stoves need to be avoided. Innate behaviors are instinctive. They do not require learning. What this means is that the animal will respond to a given stimulus in a very specific way. My example is the picture of the goose in the middle. In a normal day, when a goose is incubating its eggs, an egg can roll out of the nest. The female will then get up and roll that egg back into the nest. One of the first studies of genetics was to see if that behavior could be changed. A scientist took the egg out of the nest, set it down, and let the goose roll the egg back. He took an egg out again, put it back on the ground, let her begin to roll that egg back. Then he picked it up, let her see it, let her see him put it back in the nest, but she continued to roll a pretend egg, all the way back to the nest. What had happened was she had received a specific stimulus and she had to respond in a certain way. What he saw was a fixed action pattern. This means that the response must be carried out even if it's not necessary. The second example is an experiment that was done with babies in the 50s, and I will discuss that one in class. All of our innate behaviors are responses to changes in our physical environment. My first example is the circadian rhythm. This is an organism's internal clock. This is what tells us when to wake up and when to go to sleep. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about how I always wake up at 6 o'clock. They're not responding to the number 6. What they're responding to is the placement of the sun in the sky or the intensity of the sun in the sky. Our second innate behavior are seasonal responses. These are changes to the environment due to long-term weather changes such as fall and winter. Our examples would be migration. African animals migrate as they follow the seasonal rains. Birds fly south for the winter. We also have a seasonal response in terms of finding mates. Sea turtles will return to the beaches where they hatched. And then of course we have hibernation. Another very important innate behavior is communication. The first of these are pheromones. These are chemical signals that are given out by one individual that cause a response in another. My example is the picture on the right. These are ants. Ants use pheromones to direct other members of the nest to food sources. So what we have in the left part of this picture is a petri dish full of ants. The scientist has drawn a trail of pheromones out in that S shape. The color red is for us so that we can see it. When he releases the ants, they follow that pheromone trail in the hopes of finding food. Species recognition calls are just those sounds that we recognize between animals, the croaks of frogs, the barking of dogs, and so on. Visual displays during courtship are all those things that animals do to find mates and to convince this potential mate to choose them. Fireflies will use the color and patterns of their light flashes, and male birds will do dances and sing songs. And I have an example of a bird of paradise that's doing a visual display to court a female. Social behaviors between animals of the same species are also examples of innate behavior. My first example is agonistic behavior. This is the scientific word for aggression. This occurs as a result of competition for resources or for mates. The second is dominance hierarchies. In this case, the most dominant male or female will lead the group. They get the pick of the resources, they get the pick of the mates. The rest of the social group is then organized from the next most dominant down to the most submissive. This is usually decided by strength and size. And what's interesting in these groups is when a hierarchy is disturbed, tension increases because the individuals don't know where they belong. Once the hierarchy has been reestablished, tension within the group will actually drop. Territoriality. In this case, a male will establish a territory that includes resources or mates or anything that he feels he needs to survive, and he will defend that from any type of intruder. Our last type of innate behavior is altruistic. Altruistic behavior is defined as an unselfish behavior that one individual does that benefits the group as a whole, meaning that one individual gives something up for the good of the whole. For example, I have prairie dog as my picture. In this case, the prairie dogs have watchers when the rest of the group is out eating. These watchers look for predators. They don't eat when they're on watch. When they see a predator, they give a warning call, and all of the colony will hide. In this case, their altruistic behavior is the fact that they give up eating time so that they can watch. will, of course, eat later. Altruistic behavior is something of a controversy because the idea is that you have to understand that you are giving something up in order for it to be altruistic, and not all biologists are convinced that in this case the prairie dog knows that he is being unselfish. We're going to shift our study now to learned behaviors. And as I said, this is an altered behavior as a result of experience. There are 4 different kinds of learning, and we will look at each one of them separately. Our first example is imprinting. Imprinting is a way for young to learn very quickly. This happens right after they're born, and there's a connection between the babies and their mother. The idea is that they will look to their mother, and their mother then will teach them the foods that they need to eat, the places they need to go for safety, and how to behave correctly within their social group. Birds and mammals are born with a pre-programmed drive to imprint on their mother. If their real mother isn't around, they will imprint on the first living organism that they see. So in this case, these ducklings have imprinted on the dog. The problem with these types of imprinting is the babies that imprint on the wrong adult will receive the wrong information and will have difficulties as they grow up. Our next type of learning is called classical or Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlovian because it's the work of a scientist named Pavlov. In this case, there are 2 different kinds of stimuli given, the unconditioned and the conditioned. And I'll tell you what that all means in a second. So what he did in his experiment, before he started anything, he noticed that when he fed his dogs, the dogs got all excited that dinner was coming and would drool. This is an instinctive response. He called that an unconditioned stimulus because they weren't trained to do anything when it came to them. It was just food. And their drooling, again, which wasn't trained, was unconditioned response. He wanted to see if he could switch that around. So he picked something that they never respond to, like a bell. He rings the bell, dog doesn't care. It's a neutral stimulus. Then what he would do is he would ring the bell and give them food. At first, they did just as they normally did. They did nothing when the bell rang, but they drooled when the food showed up. Over time, they began to expect that food to come when the bell rang. Ring the bell, the dogs drool. A conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response, meaning they got the dog to respond to something that they normally wouldn't respond to. In operant conditioning, an animal changes its behavior in response to receiving a reward or to avoid a punishment. This is the work of B.F. Skinner and his Skinner box. The experiment began when a rat was placed in a box. As it explored the box, it would accidentally push a lever and a pellet of food would drop out. Soon it learned that if it pressed the lever, it would receive a piece of food. It altered its behavior to receive a reward. The Skinner box had been modified at a later date by other experimenters. In this case, a series of wires were added to the bottom of the cage. These wires would give the rat a small shock if it didn't behave in the way that the experimenter wanted. So the experimenter would turn on a light, the rat would then go over and push the lever, and the food would come out. If it didn't go to the lever, or it didn't go to the lever fast enough, it would get shocked. And so in this case, it would go to the lever and push the lever quickly to avoid being shocked, to avoid a punishment. What they discovered, though, is given enough time, habituation would occur. In this case, you have a decrease in response to a repeated stimulus, meaning that the rat no longer cared about getting its foot shocked and so wouldn't go to get the food, or the treat, the food, wasn't enough to make the rat go and get it, so the reward would have to be changed. In order to get an animal to learn through operant conditioning, they have to be given a reinforcement, something that makes them want to change their behavior. There are three types. First, there's positive, which is a reward that is given for correct behavior. When we're talking about the Skinner box, that's the pellet of food. There is punishment, where an animal carries out the desired behavior to avoid a harmful experience, something that's painful. Again, in our Skinner box, that would be the wires and the shock. There is negative reinforcement. Again, the animal is going to carry out a desired behavior to avoid an experience, but in this case the experience is just uncomfortable or irritating. If we're talking about a human experience, if you were little and you were supposed to clean your room, a positive reinforcement would be a cookie, a negative reinforcement would be timeout, and a punishment reinforcement would be a spanking. The idea of insight learning or problem solving is not accepted by all biologists. Those organisms that are believed to show insight or problem solving are the higher order or the higher thinking animals such as chimps, octopus, and dolphins. In my picture, the octopus has been shown a problem. Food has been placed in a jar and the lid's been screwed on. The octopus have actually been able to figure out how to unscrew the jar to get at the food. The dolphins, this is a single pod, a single group of dolphins that have learned to use a sponge to protect their nose. What happens is dolphins dig through the seabed to look for food hidden within the rocks. Doing so actually cuts up their noses. In this particular group, they've learned that if they pull a sponge off and then hold it over their nose as they dig through the seabed, they can avoid getting those cuts. The last thing we'll look at is the idea of nature versus nurture. Scientists have long debated as to whether it's your heredity that makes you who you are or your learned experiences. Nature says it's your genetics that make you behave in the way you do. Nurture would say that's the things that you have learned that make you behave the way you do. And we're going to do a nature versus nurture debate in class. This is the end of Chapter 55, Animal Behavior.